Hello, and thank you for joining us for our session, The Power of Picture Books, Integrating Literacy and Social Studies with Dawnavyn and Erin. I'm Dawnavyn James, also known as Queendom Teaching on Instagram, and I'm a Black History educator and researcher, PhD student, forever kindergarten teacher, and I'm also the author of Beyond February, which will be publishing on October 31st.
Hi, y'all. I'm Erin Green. You can find me on Instagram at Disruptive Narratives. I'm a critical elementary social studies educator and researcher. I'm a PhD candidate. I am forever a fifth grade teacher, and I am a curriculum writer and frequent contributor to Rethinking Schools.
So today we want to focus on a problem that we've encountered with elementary educators, getting back to the basics or starting the basics or examining the basics of integrating social studies in ELA, and then talk about books. So the problem that we've run into, that teachers are running into, is that they feel as if they don't have time to teach social studies. And according to Social Studies for a Better World, Noreen and Katie talk about how while explicit time for social studies is increasingly less common in elementary schools' daily schedules, these disciplines are nonetheless the heartbeat of every classroom, which is what Erin and I definitely believe. So in a survey of 91 pre-service teachers, Hockman found that over the course of 60 hours of fieldwork, more than 2/3 of pre-service teachers observed fewer than 3 social studies lessons in their elementary placements, which could be because of this feeling that there isn't time to teach it. But social studies is already happening in your classrooms, in your other content areas, in whole class discussions, at recess, and I'm sure that y'all could add so many other ways that social studies is happening in your classroom and in your schools to this list. So what we want to really focus on again is the power of picture books. So we're going to talk about how to pick those picture books and where to go to look for them. So social justice books, and I'm sure Erin can add to this, has a really cool website that lists a lot of books that can be used in the classroom, and they have great criteria for teachers to use as a guide on how to choose those picture books. And Social Studies for a Better World has such a long list of children's literature that can be used to teach social studies. So going to both of those websites are really good resources for you to have.
Social justice books in particular is really powerful because they have so many book lists by categories. So if you're thinking that you might want to integrate some social studies into your school day through like a specific topic, you can go to social justice books and click on that topic, and they'll provide you with a whole list of books that are specific to different grade levels and like subgenres. So really powerful, and always my go-to place. And it's constantly updated, and they have lots of reviews. And also some criteria if you want to go outside of there to pick your own book. It has criteria to help you do that.
So you have your picture book. Now, what are you going to do? So one of the things that we do when analyzing or choosing picture books for the classroom is really dissecting the picture book and finding all the places that we can get information from. It is easy to just read a book and move on, but there's so many crevices and places where you can find information like dates, there's song titles, there's usually further reading lists. And some books also, especially when they focus on social studies and historical events, come with a timeline that you can also use. But two of our big resources and places that we go to are the author's note that are right in the back of the book. You don't have to go anywhere else. You can just go to the end pages and find the author's note. A lot of books do have them, and they provide so much more information than what's in the text and illustrations of a picture book. And then you can also just easily Google the title of the book and the educator's guide. And there are some really awesome educator's guides out there for educators on ways to use their books in the classroom. And a lot of educators' guides that I've found will also list out the different standards that can be met through using their books. So we want to dive into examining the multiple powers of picture books. And one way that you can, hone in on that power is by creating book collections. They're sometimes called book stacks, but they're basically a set of books that share a theme. So we have 3 book collections here that we've used to teach with. Here's a book collection for Indigenous peoples, one for Harlem Renaissance, and then this one here I've used for kindergarten for civics. So what you're basically looking for is a collection of books that you can place together to teach a concept. And we're going to dive into primary sources here in a bit, but we want to show you kind of how primary sources can be used. And Erin and I use primary sources differently. And so for kindergarten, I often find primary sources to pair with my picture books, and I use my primary sources before I read the book. So for this example, we were reading Unspeakable, The Tulsa Race Massacre by Carol Boston Weatherford and Floyd Cooper. So before diving into the book, looking at the illustrations, before I even read, I shared this image on our smart board, and I asked my students these 3 questions. What do you see? What do you think? What do you want to know? And so these are their responses to that book or to this photograph, but it really just kind of gets their brains going and thinking about what we might be reading. And so I use the picture book as a way to kind of answer the questions that they might have about the image, or to confirm any of their guesses or inferences about what we're going to read about. So you can see some of their responses there about they think that people are putting out a fire, the town is flooded, and then my favorite comment is, I wish it was more colorful, because for them it's kind of hard to tell, but it just really kind of gets their minds ready for what we're about to explore in the picture book.
So I also use primary sources when I'm reading picture books all the time, but it is a really interesting difference that with kindergartners, Dawnavyn uses them primarily before, and I primarily use my primary sources after reading. It's interesting that like the sources we're using, students of any age could engage with, but they're engaging with them in different ways. So this is an example that I've used in class. So Memphis Martin and the Mountaintop is a fabulous children's book by Alice Faye Duncan, and it's about the Memphis sanitation strike of 1968, which is the protest that Dr. King was involved in when he was assassinated. So when I teach this book, I read the book first, and then afterwards, we dive into a whole set of primary sources. And I use that really as a way to deepen our learning into the topic. So really, mine is set up where the book teaches us, and then the primary sources kind of confirm it and challenge us to go farther, which I think it's so cool that both kindergartners and 5th graders and adults, we can all engage in these resources, but in different ways with different strategies.
Yeah.
All right, so how to find and use a primary source or a set of primary sources. We're going to talk about places to go and strategies that we can implement. So first, pick your children's book, right? So Dawnavyn and I have both modeled choosing children's books that are endorsed by social justice books. We love that they already have those lists for us, that they have already reviewed these books and have identified them as strong literature to use towards aims of justice. So here are two amazing picture books that have come out recently about Bayard Rustin, who was a key advisor to Dr. King, but was kept out of the movement, out of the front of the movement because of his queer identity. So either one of these books or both books could be used to learn more about Bayard Rustin. So after choosing the books, and of course, reading the author's note and seeing if there's an educator's guide, as teachers, we identify key parts of the story that might be enhanced with primary sources. And then also we think about when we want to use them. Do you want to use the primary source as a hook to get into the book? Do you want to use that primary source while you're reading? Or do you want to use it kind of after you've read? Once you have an idea of how you might want to use primary sources, then we're just going to do some good old Googling. There are definitely websites that are just for primary sources that you could go to, but I have found that Googling, if you have the right combination of words, is kind of your best bet. And you might end up at some of those websites that are recommended in the end, but Googling is a great start. So this, the next few slides are kind of a model of how I did this process with this topic of Bayard Rustin and these two picture books. So to find primary sources of Bayard Rustin, I Googled any combination of these words that you see on the screen. Bayard Rustin, March on Washington photos, Bayard Rustin, March on Washington primary sources, Bayard Rustin primary sources, MLK with Bayard Rustin archives, Bayard Rustin digital archives. So that first Google search gave me these photographs, which is a great start. There's really powerful photographs here, and some of these will come up in the ones that I chose to use. When I searched specifically for archives, I got a really good depth of sources. So there's a lot of digital archives where historians and archivists have already done this work for us. So they've taken all of these sources and compiled them into a collection. So you don't have to start from scratch. You can use someone else's archive. We don't have to reinvent the wheel, right? We can use work that has already been done. I did find, however, that when I searched for Bayard Rustin's archives, because his story is still not front and center, his documents have not all been digitized. So there is a Library of Congress archive with all of his papers that we can't access unless you go visit the Library of Congress. But when I added digital archive into the search, I was able to find some things that are digitally available. So the Civil Rights Digital Library from the University of Georgia was really helpful. It was this link down here. And you can see here, there's like oral history recordings here and a bunch of other stuff too. So the key is, it's really, once you do this Googling, it's about finding the right rabbit hole and then just jumping down it. So once I found the right rabbit hole, I was able to find a ton of sources. So some of the sources you can look for are sources that match the illustrations or the text, which add credibility to the historical narrative, which also, the way Dawnavyn does it, these are also great hooks. You could show this picture of Bayard Rustin and then introduce the book, and the kids will be like, oh my gosh, that's the picture we just saw, right? So we can start that excitement, or we can use them later on, because the same excitement can be seen when students realize, oh, the picture on the front of the book is modeled after a real picture. So either way, it's really powerful to match the illustrations. Down here, we have a page from Unstoppable, the Bayard Rustin book. And this one I was so excited to find, because this truly is like, it's so clear that the illustrator here modeled this illustration after this photograph. So one way is to find illustrations that match. And then here's some more illustrations that are very similar, or some more primary sources that are very similar to the illustration. So here's another page from Unstoppable. We say Bayard Rustin and A. Philip Randolph looking over the map. And then with some Googling and finding the right rabbit hole, I was able to locate an image that's very, very similar of Bayard Rustin holding up this map. You can also look for sources that push students' understanding and extend the narrative. So I started out here by finding a primary source that really matches the illustration. And then I was wondering, how are other newspapers reporting on this same event? So this, you can tell that this article, the newspaper article that's featured in the book, is from the Washington Afro-American. And so the way that the Washington Afro-American is reporting this event says they're pouring in from all over. says, don't let right's enemies provoke you, leaders urge. So it's really a pro-march article. So I'm curious about how other places are reporting on this. So then if you look at some other majority white publications, we see police in Washington worried by reports of Negro March plan. That's very different reporting than what we're seeing from the Afro-American newspaper. This one's also an op-ed that says proposed Washington Negro March could embarrass President Kennedy. Again, we have multiple perspectives seen here. So students could look at multiple kinds of newspaper articles and compare perspective for how this event is being reported on. So once we choose the sources, the direction that we kind of want to go, then we can craft questions for students to engage with the sources. When we're writing questions for students to engage with, to analyze primary sources, we always want to start with observation, then we can move into inference, and then we can move into analysis. I think Dawnavyn did a really good job of modeling this with her kindergartners, where you saw their observations written on the source. We have to observe. And I don't know, maybe it's easier for kindergartners, but with older kids, they jump straight to inference. If you ask what's happening here, they're going to jump straight to things that they're inferring, but we have to back up and say, there's no silly observation. Say what you see. I hear that you made a great inference. Hold on to that. Come back to observation for step one. And so we spend a lot of time on step one just saying what we see. Then we can infer based on those observations and our prior knowledge, and then we can go into deeper understanding. So here's an example of this in action. So here's the same newspaper article that we saw from the illustration. And the first question is, what is this document? How do you know? So this question of what is this document is really asking them to make a lot of observations before they can infer. So when you ask, how do you know this is a newspaper? They have to have evidence for that, and those are observations. So their observations might be, I see a title, I see photographs, I see small text, and all of those things lead to the inference that this is a newspaper. And then I always think it's okay to give away the answer to the previous question in the next one. I'm not against that at all. And students will sometimes figure that out, and that's fine. That's them using their tools, right? Because I don't want them to go through all of these questions thinking that it's not a newspaper. If they didn't get that with question one, they need to know. So I'm giving it to them in question two. So the question two says, what is the date of this newspaper? And then I made sure to also add a caption, because although I found the link to this full newspaper article and you can explore it, it's still going to be kind of hard to see all the way up here. So I added a caption that says front page of the Washington Afro-American newspaper, August 27th, 1963. So here's some information that I want them to find, and they don't need to guess. They just need to find the clues in order to put it together. So I want them to know the date because we're thinking about this within the context of the March on Washington. And then I ask, who is the publisher of this newspaper? Why might that be important? And again, I'm really interested in the perspective of how the Afro-American is reporting on the March on Washington versus some other newspapers. So I want them to know that this is coming from the background of probably Black journalists, a Black newspaper, Black reporters who are in support of the march. And then I ask, what is the map in the middle of the page showing? And then I followed up with, why do you think the map is included on the front page of the paper? And what I'm getting towards is I really want students to be thinking about organizing and the effort that is put into organizing a march like this. Oftentimes when we learn about the March on Washington, we just learn about the I Have a Dream speech. We don't learn about the background, the behind the scenes work that went into it. And we certainly don't learn about Bayard Rustin very often. So I want students to know that there are key advisors who are not present in the I Have a Dream speech. So there's more context to that. And that it took a lot of work and effort and people to organize this event. So it's important that a map is on the front page of the paper. They're telling people how to navigate this event. So that's what I'm hoping students will get towards. I'm going to keep supporting their understanding with each question. There's a clear objective behind my questions. So I ask, why is the map included? And then question 6, what does this document teach you about the planning and labor required to organize the March on Washington? Bayard Rustin made this map, right? We saw pictures of him working on the map with his advisors, with A. Philip Randolph, and previous photographs and illustrations. So I want students to be thinking about the behind the scenes labor that is going into this, and then getting it into the newspaper, right? And then last, again, we're interested in the different perspectives. So I'm asking, how do you think a newspaper from a white publisher on the same day might have been similar or different? And then you could follow it up with those additional resources as well to get students really comparing and contrasting things. And I also want to point out that as educators, when you know your literacy standards, you can work social studies in so many ways, right? Because this last question is really talking about perspective. And I don't know any state that does not ask children to start learning about perspective and point of view within their ELA curriculums. So this, while it is social studies, is explicitly using or implicitly using really important language arts standards. So although Bayard Rustin may not be in your state standards, I guarantee you that analyzing multiple perspectives is. All right, so that was kind of modeling my process of how I found sources and wrote them on this specific picture book. And now we're going to show you some other examples of picture book and primary source pairings. So another picture book that I really love and that has so many clear illustration to primary source connections is Brave Girl, Clara and the Shirtwaist Maker's Strike of 1909. And it's about Clara Lamlek, who is a real person. And so this is a picture of her. And then it's about the real buildings and working conditions that these young immigrant women faced, most of them really children. So here's a picture, an illustration from the book, and then the primary source photograph where you can see how similar these scenes are. So this is a great example of how you might pair primary sources inside the book while you're reading. So you could really have these sources kind of printed out, and then as you're reading, stop and ask students to engage with the primary source while you're reading. You could also do it afterwards or before. You can really use them strategically at any point within the book. And sometimes working them within the book is a fun way to do that. So here's an example of the questions that I would ask students to use to engage with this source. So again, we always start with observation. So what do you notice? And this one, you really need to spend a lot of time on the noticings, particularly because this is not a scene that students are going to be familiar with for the most part. If you don't know what you're looking for, you might think these women are sitting down in a dining hall to eat together. You really have to look at the details to see what's going on. And again, the captions are always going to help them out and kind of give them enough context to really engage with the photo. So what do you notice? What stands out to you? What jobs are these women doing, and how do you know? So again, asking them to kind of cite their evidence with clues from the photograph. And then 4, what do you think it was like to work in an environment like this? So we have some inference questions happening, a little bit of empathy, thinking about what this might have been like. And then what might be unsafe about this scene? And I want you to notice here that the question is phrased as what might be unsafe, not do you think this is unsafe? We know that this was an unsafe work environment. We know that the Triangle Factory caught on fire and that hundreds of women were killed because of the negligence of people in charge. So I don't want to give students an opportunity to say that this is a safe work environment. We want them thinking about what we know to be true. And we know it is true that this was unsafe. So this is not an open-ended question to debate safety. This is asking to explore why this was unsafe. And we do that around a lot of different topics as well. If we know that the answer is something was unfair, unsafe, classist, racist, sexist, we're not going to open up a door for students to argue that it wasn't. We're just going to ask them to defend what we already know to be true. So what might be unsafe about this scene? And then 6, what kind of rules and conditions keep people safe while they're at work? So this is a bigger significance question that asks students to go beyond this photo and to think about labor rights, labor safety, labor protection in general, to really expand, zoom out. So another illustration you could pair with a primary source from the book is this photo of workers on the picket line along with this illustration. You can see how similar these are, probably more like inspired by than exactly modeled after, but very similar and very cute, lovely illustrations that also highlight the power of protest. So again, we always start with what do you notice? And then you can ask them to compare these side by side. So what do the illustration and the photograph have in common? What's different? And then there's really key vocabulary within these signs that students need to understand in order to engage with this topic. So asking, what does it mean to go on strike? And there are several ways to provide students with the vocabulary to do this. If you're doing this digitally, you can hyperlink to the resources to define it. If you're doing this as a class, you can stop and make sure that everyone knows. You could do, or probably should do, vocabulary before and during readings that they know these words. We don't want to just hope that they know it. We need to make sure that they do know what a strike is. And then once we can define strike, then we can ask, why are these women striking? And again, if we're following up on the previous photograph, then students know unsafe working conditions might have led to these women going on strike. And then why are they wearing signs? And who do you think they want to see and read these signs? I think that students oftentimes see protest signs, but they might not think about who they're for. So again, this is a literacy standard here when we're asking for students to identify an audience. This is identifying an audience. Who is the audience of these signs? And then again, the last question zooms out again and asks what other work goes into organizing a strike. And I think this question is important because students oftentimes are taught that protest means making signs and giving speeches. And so right here, we do see women holding signs, but we want to think about the larger structures, the larger fight going on here of what other work is happening, right? If we're thinking like Bayard Rustin, like he's not going to be in the photos all the time, but his work is key to making the March on Washington happen. So who are the people behind the scenes in this strike who are making it happen? Here's another one, another great illustration and photo that are clearly inspired. The illustrations inspired by the photo. So again, we always start with what do you notice? What do the illustration and the photograph have in common? Do you see someone on the stage? That's actually a yes or no question. I might rewrite that one. But what does the person look like who is on the stage could be one question. And the purpose of this is that we want students to see that this is a mass meeting of striking young immigrant women, but it is being led by a male union leader. And we want students to be thinking about the disconnect that might be happening between young women and them being represented by an older man. So what does this person look like? We're trying to get them to get towards, he looks masculine. What differences do you notice between the people listening and the person speaking? And then again, here we kind of give them that answer, right? We give them that answer further on. What frustrations might the women feel while listening to a man lead their meeting? So if it's really important that they get to an understanding, it's okay to give them that answer in further questions. And then again, that last question zooms out and asks, why might it be important for a women's organization to have women leaders? So zooming out to significance across multiple contexts, thinking about female union leadership in general.
So the book that I chose to kind of dissect and break down with primary sources is How Do You Spell Unfair by Carol Boston Weatherford and Frank Morrison. And so I'm gonna dive a little deeper into the one article, but I also think a lot of the historical picture books that are used in classrooms can also connect to current events, which is also social studies. And so I wanted to feature this photograph of Zayla, who is the first Black American to win the Scripps National Spelling Bee, because it connects so well with Magnolia Cox and the National Spelling Bee. Even though they're years and years apart, there's still that connection there. And so then children can look at current events too and how that connects to the past. And so I also included this photo from a newspaper of Magnolia Cox as well. So we're going to dive in. So what I think is really cool about how do you spell unfair is that there's spelling throughout. So that's your ELA. But as Erin was talking about vocabulary in different books, in this one, those vocabulary words that are important for students to know, and I didn't include an example of it, but are spelled out as if someone is spelling it out. So there's the word unfair, I think the word racism, determination. So those words are bolded and spelled out for students. So that's another way that sometimes authors and illustrators include vocabulary words. But from this primary source, there were 2 pages that I felt would pair well with it. And so from this newspaper clipping, it talks about Magnolia being part of this big send-off where there were 3,000 people. And further down, so that's where this image is from, where the people with the horns and the balloons, and they're sending her off to Washington, D.C. for the spelling bee. But further down in this article, I couldn't put it here like shape wise, but it talks about how she once she gets to DC, she's whisked off to the home of a doctor. And so having kids kind of analyze these photos or for these articles for as Erin was talking about, perspective and who the audience is and who wrote these articles and why it's important for us to know that Magnolia was whisked off somewhere to someone's home instead of to a hotel, and looking at the time period is really important for kids to analyze. The next one, I think I break it down a little more here. So here's that same clip, but if you can see here at the bottom, it says at Surgeon's home, the 13-year-old colonial school girl had her first glimpse of Washington. She was breathless. She was whisked to the home. I think his name is Dr. Jones. So looking at the time period and talking about what the book presents versus what the primary source presents. So in this article, it doesn't tell us why Magnolia is whisked off to the home of a surgeon, but in the book, it talks about how she could not stay in a hotel because the hotels where all the other participants for the spelling bee were staying was for white people only. So having those conversations with students as well. And I pulled my questions for these primary sources from the Educator's Guide. So if you don't feel comfortable or confident or feel like you can't come up with the best questions for students to answer and discuss in your classroom, the Educator's Guides have really good resources. And this particular one has a list of discussion questions that match perfectly with the 2 illustrations I showed before. So the first one, looking at the military band in a crowd of 1,000 people sending her off to Washington. Why do you think it may have been important to community members to celebrate Magnolia? So talking about that. And the author talks about she will face some hard truths. What is the author trying to convey by saying this? How do the illustrations help the reader confirm their understanding of this phrase? So really dissecting again, even the text and what the meaning is behind those things. You may not, the author may not always just outright say it, but having these questions for students to discuss is really important. This was probably one of my favorite primary sources to find that kind of connected here with this illustration. But down at the bottom, you see the illustration where there's Magnolia and another Black girl who is part of the spelling bee are at a separate table than the white participants. And so I found this newspaper clipping of everyone at this banquet that they talk about. But in the newspaper clipping, it doesn't tell the history that the author does in the picture book. So one of the questions is, once Magnolia and her mother arrive at the spelling bee banquet, they are told to climb the stairs and enter the ballroom through a back door. How do you think Magnolia and her mother may have felt at this time? So again, really having those discussions and committing to talking about these topics and not glossing over them. So I also was thinking too, just even looking at the photograph from the newspaper clipping, having students look at the expressions to see how Magnolia and her mother are feeling. There's not an illustration of the banquet in the picture book. I don't think, but having this actual photograph of what was happening can really get students to see these emotions and also acknowledge them. Sometimes there are picture books that we read and we don't want to acknowledge the emotions that are happening, but oftentimes in my experience, especially with kindergarten, they are going to address those emotions because they naturally, really want to talk about them, like how someone was feeling and how they might feel. But you can also look at what they might notice from the photograph from the newspaper, what they wonder, and again, acknowledging how Magnolia would feel having to go a different route to get somewhere, and then sitting in the middle amongst these people. We can see it on her and her mother's face, how they're feeling at this time, and then connecting that to this image of them sitting at the spelling bee, participating, but having to be separated because of their race. And so here is another source. This clipping is about Magnolia stumbling over the word nemesis. And so here's an example again, I'm glad that I included that, of how these vocabulary words are featured in the text. So they're spread out as if someone is spelling them. And so when I read it, that's how I read it. I read it as Nemasis, nemesis, to kind of make a point that this is a book about spelling, which I think is really awesome. But this page talks about how Magnolia misspells nemesis. But really, what really stood out to me is that in Magnolia's dictionary, it's spelled, I forget the other way that it's spelled, but she spells it in the way that it represents a proper noun referring to the Greek goddess. And they mark her wrong. They say she's disqualified because she spelled it wrong. And so these two questions, I think, do a really good job of getting kids to think about that. So once Magnolia advances to the final five, the judges throw her curveball, a word she hadn't studied. That word was not on the official list. Do you think it was fair? And so again, we're going back to the title of the book. And kids often, especially kindergartners, always are talking about when something is fair or unfair. So having these conversations too about how that can look. So do you think it was fair for the judges to ask Magnolia to spell this word because it wasn't on the list? And also thinking about why they would have her spell a word that she hadn't studied. And then this question number 6 talks about her being eliminated. And how the author shares that becoming a finalist in the National Spelling Bee was still an achievement, even though she didn't win, but she still accomplished something. So having kids too, and that brings in also like social emotional learning too, that you may not always win something, but what else could you have won? And Magnolia overcame so much more than making it to the spelling bee, especially all the things she had to face because she was Black and there was racism involved. And so another thing that I like to pair picture books with, so here are 2 images from the Educator's Guide. So I pulled those discussion questions from that discussion questions list. And then there are some classroom activities too for students to engage with that pair with the book. But another thing that I like to do is pair books with other picture books. And so some of these books are by the same illustrator and author as How Do You Spell Unfair that I think pair well, especially when looking at Black history. Standing in the Need of Prayer it talks about the spiritual of the song, but also it's like a timeline of Black history, one of the many timelines of Black history that Carol Boston Weatherford has written. So I think that is just perfect to pair because same author illustrator. Same thing with Unspeakable, which I mentioned earlier, and Respect, but also because Magnolia is a child, pairing a book like Let the Children March, again, Magnolia's activism looked different than going out to march. Like for her to go and be a part of this, even though she was going to face that, not that she was going to face, that she faced so much racism, pairs so well with books like Let the Children March, who are also dealing with that. And then I also included Choosing Brave, especially since in How Do You Spell Unfair, it talks about these words like determination and continuing to go. And so this book is about Emmett Till's mother, Mamie Till, which I think is also a wonderful book to just pair, looking at Black children within Black history. So you can pair picture books with primary sources, with Educator's Guide, but also building essentially a collection and pairing picture books with other picture books. So that problem that we had earlier is no longer a problem. And we really do want y'all to understand that social studies is always happening. We just have to take the time to acknowledge it, and bringing social studies into your ELA time, using picture books and generating these questions and finding these primary sources can help you to teach social studies all the time, even though it's always happening. So acknowledging that in the classroom. But the solution to your problem is that you now have the strategies to integrate ELA and social studies together, just by finding some primary sources and building a stack of books and reading to your students and engaging them in these wonderful discussions. Did you want to add something, Erin? I'm sure you did.
Yeah, my internet went out.
Oh, no, you're good.
Yes, we have the strategies. We can do it. I think that the feeling that we don't have time for social studies is very real. It is cut from our schedules all the time. And so we have to be creative and intentional. And using picture books and primary sources is such a powerful way to not only integrate social studies, include social studies, but do it through a lens that really centers justice and liberation and powerful histories, and acknowledging and centering the multiple identities of all of our students in our communities.
I think you can talk about this way better than I can. You're really good.
Well, Dawnavyn and I are excited to announce that we are going to be continuing to collaborate together on projects like this one, and working with educators and putting out more resources for you guys. So together we are Big Histories for Little Learners, and we have put together a Google site. It is very much in its infancy right now, but we're going to continue building up resources and sharing things there. So if you are interested in the work we've done today, or if you want to find more picture books and primary sources, you can find those and more of our recommendations at this Google site. You can either pull out your phone and scan this QR code, or you can type in the address below. Yeah, and you'll find us there. Big Histories for Little Learners.
Yeah, so thank y'all so much. And again, please feel free to reach out to us. We love to talk with elementary educators as forever elementary educators. And we really, truly do love social studies. So please, please, please feel free to reach out to us. And thank y'all for being here today.
Thank you, guys.